Hello. In this video, we're going to talk about the midpoint formula, and then in the next video, we're going to also discuss the distance formula. These are two essential formulas when working with geometry, and we're going to use these all throughout the year. So it's very important to learn these formulas and when we're supposed to use each one. Before you head into this lesson, just a reminder that for class, the first thing you were supposed to do on the hyperdoc was the discussion question. So it asked, does a line have a midpoint? Now, let me say this question again. Does a line have a midpoint? So think about why or why not a line would or would not have a midpoint. How would you find it? And then what are some words that are similar to the word midpoint? Think mid. What are other words that are similar to that you would use in your everyday life? So use the Padlet board to respond with at least one sentence. So you would click on this link and answer the question. And just a reminder to try not to look at what other people say first. Your response is not graded for correct or incorrect answer, just that you responded with intention. So as long as you give a reason for your answer, then you will get your full points, whether it's right or not. So let's head into today's lesson. So first of all, we're going to talk about midpoint. So a midpoint of a segment is the point that divides the segment into two congruent segments. So first of all, the midpoint is a point and remember that to name a point, you use capital letters. So it's the point that divides the segment, or a segment, into two congruent, and if you want, you can start using the symbol for congruence in your notes, which is an equal sign with a squiggle on top. This symbolizes congruence. So two congruent segments. And congruent just means that the length of the two segments is equal. So congruent means that the lengths are equal. Remember last lesson we talked about congruent segments, equal length. Congruent segments, equal length. Okay, and this brings us back to the Padlet discussion. So it says, is there a midpoint of a line? Well, remember that a line is continuous. That's why it has arrows on the end. So it goes on forever and ever. So if you don't know the length of that line, then you can't find the middle of it. So no, a line does not have a midpoint. Only a segment could have a midpoint. Even a ray cannot have a midpoint. So a ray starts at one point and goes in another direction. So that can also not have a midpoint because it extends on one direction forever without end. So only segments can have midpoints. All right, so this question says, if M is the midpoint of segment PQ, then, well, according to the definition of a midpoint of a segment, we know that the segments are congruent. So if M is the midpoint, then segments are congruent. Segments are congruent. So mathematically, we would write PM, segment PM, is congruent to segment MQ. All right, now because they are congruent, we also know that based off the definition of congruent segments, that their lengths are equal. Their lengths are equal. So then you can say that PM is equal to MQ. So the length of PM is equal to the length of MQ. Now, PM and MQ, their lengths are represented by these two expressions. So next we can substitute the expressions for the letters. So 4x minus 1 equals 12x minus 17, and then we can use algebra to solve for x. So adding 17 over, and at the same time, I'm also going to subtract 4x because I want my x's to stay positive. So this would give us 16x equals 8x. Oops, sorry, just 16 equals 8x. Divided by 8, x is 2. Now, technically, it didn't really ask us to find an answer, but we'll just assume it asks us to find for x. Okay, so at this point, you might be wondering, okay, for all of these problems, do I have to write out all of this? Well, no, not yet, at least. So you don't have to write out these words in your steps. I would like you to start getting into the habit of showing the geometry and then switching over to the algebra. But really, the reason why I walked you through this whole thought process was for in another chapter or two, we're going to start doing proofs. And you might have heard about proofs in geometry. They're not that scary. It's just it takes a little bit to get used to the thought process that goes behind proofs. So if you understand this process of thought here, then that is essentially a proof for finding x. Okay, having a statement and then giving a reason for that statement. But no, I won't be writing out all of this for every single problem, and I don't expect you to until we start doing proofs. Okay, so let's talk about what bisect means. That might be one of the words that you thought about, and a word that would be similar to midpoint. So bisect means to cut in one half. So to cut in half. Exactly half. So a segment bisector is anything that cuts a segment in half. So what do I mean by anything? A point can be a segment bisector. Another segment, a ray, line, or even a plane that intersects a segment at its midpoint. So here, line L is a segment bisector of segment AC at point B. Also, another thing you can note here is that, another little note, if line L bisects segment AC, then we also know that the length of AB is equal to the length of BC. Okay, now one thing to notice is that even though line L is a bisector, a segment bisector, line L is not being bisected itself. Okay, so point B may not be the midpoint of line L, or if this was a segment or a ray. Okay, so it's just AC that's being bisected. All right. So just a few simple examples. In the figure at the right, WY bisects UV at point Y, and UY bisects TW at point S. So Y here, if Y says segment WY bisects UV. So that means that UY is equal to YV. And then UY, so from U to Y, bisects TW at point S. So that means TS is congruent to SW. Okay, so pause if you need to think about that and copy down the diagram in your notes. And then for each situation, find the value of x in the measure of the indicated segment. So it says uy equals 4x minus 3, yv equals x. So we know that uy is equal to yv, so we could set these two equal to each other. So that would give you 3x equals 3, x is 1. Now it also asks you to find uv. So if we found uv, let's see. So uv is the entire thing. So we would need to find the value of part of it, which if part of it is x, when x is 1, then uv would be twice that, so 2. Okay, number 6, ws, which is the same thing as sw, and they also give us tw, which is the entire thing, 4x plus 5. So one thing you can do here is say that tw equals 2 times ws. 2 times ws. And then substitute in the expressions. So 4x plus 5 equals 2 times x plus 5. Okay, so distribute the 2. And then solve for x. 2x is 5, and x equals 2.5. And then it says to find TS. Now TS is the same as SW, so you plug in 2.5 for x, 2.5 plus 5, so TS is 7.5. All right. Let's see. This is just a reminder of how to work with fractions. So if you have a mixed number multiplied by a whole number, you're going to want to change the mixed number to an improper fraction. So do 7 times 3 plus 2. So 21 plus 2 is 23 sevenths. And then times, multiplying a fraction by a whole number, you change the whole number to a fraction with a denominator of 1. So 2 over 1. And that would give you 46 sevenths. And you can actually leave your answer like that. I'm okay with that. Or you can change it to a mixed number if you'd like, but improper fraction is fine. Now with this one, we would do the same thing for the mixed number. So this would be 18 plus 1 is 19 halves. And now if you're dividing by a whole number, you can multiply by the reciprocal. So times this, the whole number would be 2 over 1, so the reciprocal would be 1/2. So this would be 19 fourths. All right. So the next part, we're talking about what the actual midpoint formula is. So for on a number line, midpoint is really just the average. Okay, so to take an average, you subtract the endpoints, or sorry, you add up the endpoints and then you divide by 2. So endpoint plus endpoint and then divided by 2. So here we would do negative 14 plus 2 over 2, negative 12 halves would give us negative 6. So negative 6 would be our midpoint. Now, it's different on a coordinate plane because in a coordinate plane, each point has a value for x and a value for y. So if you want to find the midpoint, then you would have to take the average of the horizontal distance and the vertical distance. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to draw in a right triangle to represent that based off of the 2 points that I have. So the horizontal distance from point A to point B would be from 1 to 7, looking at the x's, from 1 to 7. So that would give us 6. And then the vertical distance goes from 2 to 4. So that would be 2 points away. Now this thought process is going to help us a little bit more when we get to the distance formula. But for now, we go back up to the average. And remember that we actually add the x's and then we'll add up the y's. So take the average of the x's and the average of the y's. So the midpoint formula, if we call this point any point x sub 1, y sub 1, which just means x1, y1, and we call the second point x2, y2, the midpoint formula is that we're going to take the average of the x's, so add up the x's and divide by 2, and then comma, that would be the x-coordinate of the midpoint. The y-coordinate would be the same thing, y1 plus y2 divided by 2 to get the average. So add up the x's, divide by 2, add up the y's, divide by 2. That is your midpoint formula. MP stands for midpoint. So whenever you're finding a midpoint, use MP to denote that. Now, a little cheer to remember is midpoint, midpoint, what do you do? Add the x's together and divide by 2. Midpoint, midpoint, what do you do? Add the y's together and divide by 2. So if you're looking for a trick to remember, that's a good one. So keep doing that cheer over in your head and you'll remember it when it comes time to take the test. Okay, so let's find the midpoint of this segment here. So let's add up the x's. 1 plus 7 is 8 over 2. Add up the y's. 2 plus 4 is 6 over 2. So our midpoint is going to be 4, 3. So 4, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3 is right there. And always mark it in the diagram if you're given a diagram. Okay. A few more practice questions. Find the coordinate of the midpoint of the segment with the given endpoints. So let's do the same thing. So remember that the midpoint is a coordinate. So if you want, you can kind of set up your coordinate there. So add the x's. 4 plus 6 is 10 over 2. Negative 1 plus 0 is negative 1 over 2. Okay, and always simplify. So this would be 5, negative 1/2. For this one here, negative 2 plus negative 3 over 2, and negative 8 plus negative 12 over 2. Okay, be careful with negatives. When you're adding two negatives, you add them together. So this would be negative 5/2. And this would be negative 20/2, which would be negative 10. Okay, so those would be the midpoints for those two questions. Now, a little different way to think about a midpoint. What if we're given one of the endpoints and the midpoint? How would you find the other endpoint? Now, one thing that you could do is graph it and then count over and up, and then double that length, double how much you go over and up to get the other endpoint. But there's also another way, more algebraically, that works, especially if you don't have whole numbers. In this case, we do, but I'm going to show you this other way as well. So we're going to go back to our midpoint formula. x1 plus x2 over 2, y1 plus y2 over 2 equals your midpoint, xy. And I'm going to plug in what I know. So I know one of the points is 6, 0. So that would be x1 and y1. So 6 and then 0. And I also know the midpoint is 0, comma 2. So I'm going to replace this. 0, 2. Now we can actually take the x-coordinate here and set it equal to the x-coordinate of the midpoint. So 6 plus x2 over 2 equals 0. And then you would solve for x. So to solve for x, you would first multiply both sides by the denominator of 2, or you can think about 2 over 1. So this becomes 6 plus x2 equals 0. So x2 is negative 6. And then do the same thing for the y's. Set this equal to 2. So y2 over 2 equals 2. Multiply both sides by 2. So y2, this cancels. Y2 equals 4. And then you would put both of your answers as a point, negative 6, comma 4, and that would be point S. Okay, so go ahead and try doing number 4, and then when you write your answer, write parentheses, number, comma, number, close parentheses, no spaces in between. Okay, so after you do that, then you can do the Edgelastic homework, and then tomorrow you'll watch the video for distance formula.